This is Corral again from Corral Finley McLean, that is, from welcome.com. Today what I'm going to talk about is a little bit difficult. I've been examining, trying to understand why, especially English speakers, since that's what I am, an English speaker, why is it that we can study languages for years and years? You know, you study French, you study German, you study Portuguese, you study Spanish, and yet we go to these countries and we can't speak the language at all. It's almost as if we've never studied at all. So I've been doing some studies and doing some research and even doing some experiments. And I think I've come up with an answer, or not exactly, not the answer, but at least an answer. And what I'm going to try to do today is try to put in as concise a form as possible why is learning a language, and maybe especially for English speakers, but maybe not exclusively to us. I'm not saying that it's exclusively to English speakers, but it also does include English speakers. Why is it so difficult? Because I think I read a study. Yeah, I read a study, and I can't remember when and where and what it said, but they were talking about people who speak English. Now, I'm not sure if they were talking about people whose first language is not English. The best of those speakers are just the best of English speakers. And if they're talking about the best of non-English speakers who speak English very well, it's the Northern Europeans, ironically enough. Right? Are you talking about the best speakers of English? Once again, if I read the study correctly, it's the Northern Europeans. That they understand English much better than the average English speaker. And I mean average not just in the United States, but I also mean in Britain. I'm in the United Kingdom, maybe Australia, New Zealand, where English is the dominant language, not the only language, but the dominant language. So, do you remember when I was showing you how to do a 5-paragraph essay, and I had the metaphor, and I had a stool, and I had the legs? Well, I come up with the same metaphor when it comes to learning a foreign language. You can even use this as far as learning one's own language, because I teach this way, even when I'm teaching English to native English speakers. But I definitely teach this way when I'm teaching English to non-native English speakers, because one of my fields is ESL. Okay, so here it is. So we have a stool here, correct? This is a stool, once again, and we have our legs. Now, instead of this being a 5-paragraph essay, this is learning a foreign language. Be consistent here and put this as a capital F. Okay, so this is learning a foreign language. I think in most language classes, the first thing that's taught, and which just makes sense, right, are expressions like buenos dias, buenas tardes, things like that, right? But, so it would be vocabulary. So I'm going from the easiest to, I guess you could say, the hardest. But once you get over here, it's really hard to detail distinguish between what's harder than the other. But here, vocabulary. You know what? Let me write this in another pen. Okay. Vocabulary. Now, vocabulary, to a sense, is very easy to learn, because it's a matter of how do you say lámpara, how do you say bed, cama, how do you say door, puerta, how do you say window, ventana. Okay, so that's relatively easy to learn if you just think in the sense that you're just exchanging one word for the other. The problem is that's not what you do. For example, buenas tardes is good night, okay, or good evening, correct? But we all know that the concept of good night in English is different than buenas tardes in Spanish, okay? So I can't just teach the word buenas tardes in Spanish, meaning good evening or good night, I also have to teach the concept of how you use buenas tardes in English. That is, when you're leaving and it's in the evening, or it's especially when it's at nighttime, when you're leaving, you say good night. Correct? Right? Buenas noches, excuse me. I said buenas tardes, I meant buenas noches. When you're leaving at night, because buenas tardes is good evening. When you're leaving at night, you say buenas noches, correct? Right? Why? Because in English, buenas noches is not just good night in the sense of you come in or you come out and it's the nighttime, you just say good night. You only say good night when you're leaving. So I have to not only teach that expression, buenas noches, I also have to teach how you use it in English. So if you only know the expression, you only know the word buenas, and you only know the word noches, and you come in and you say, buenas noches, a todos, buenas noches, okay? Or you come in and you say, buenas noches, senora, right? But you say it in English, and you say, good night. She's thinking, why is he's already telling me goodbye if he just came in? So that's the difference between learning vocabulary words, but learning the concept behind those vocabulary words. And that's harder. So vocabulary in itself may appear to be easier, or to some people it's very difficult. Do I have to, my students with me, do I have to memorize all of that? Well, of course you do, right? Of course you do. It's not a matter of memorization, it's a matter of associating the word with the object or the word with the action. Then I think what would be next, yes, would be structure. And structure I'm going to put as grammar. Right? So let's just look at this. If I want to teach, or I want you to learn the simple present tense or the present indicative, that's not hard at all, right? What I would do is, let me just do something over here. I have the verb hablar as an example, correct? And I tell you, in order to do the present indicative, I'm only talking about the AR verbs, of course, because I have to explain that there's the AR and the ER verb, right? And then I just remove the AR, and then you don't really need it, but just in the beginning, you can put the yo, the tu, the el, the ella, the usted, then the nosotros, then the ellos, ellas, and ustedes, right? And then show you, this is called conjugating the verb. This is very easy. All I do is say, do this, and then when you have the yo, you always put the O, tu, you always put the S. Now in this case, it would be the AS. The L, ella, you just put the, without the S, the habla. Then nosotros hablamos. Then hablan. Now this in itself can seem complicated, but it's not really. Because once I teach you the rule for the AR verb, the ER verb, the IR verb, it's not complicated. Even the irregular verbs aren't complicated. It's a matter of memorization, obviously, but it's not super complicated. What becomes complicated when you're teaching the grammar, right, is how do you use it? When do you use it? When do you use this tense called present indicative? I can even teach you the subjunctive, right? And the subjunctive, let's say I'm going to erase this. Now, subjunctive is not a tense, it's a mood. Correct? We talked about this in one of the other videos. This is the subjunctive, mood, not tense, right? And if it's AR verb, well, no problem. It takes the ER endings, right? So I erase all of this, just erase the endings, that's all you have to erase. And then, if it takes the ER endings with the yo and the L and the A and usted taking the same ending, so it's hable, hables, hable, hablemos, y hablan. The only big difference is that when it's subjunctive, you don't have the O ending. So it's yo, él, ella, usted hable, tú hables, nosotros hablemos, ellos, ellas, ustedes hablan. I can teach that. That's no big deal. The problem comes in, though. The problem comes in is to teach you how to use the subjunctive. What's the difference between the subjunctive and the present indicative? That's where the problem comes in. So the student is not just using a different mood or a different tense because they don't know how, but they just use it, right? So when you get down here, this is where it gets difficult. And frankly, I don't know which is more difficult. But here now you're talking about concept. So concepts. How do you use these things that you've been taught? That's where it gets difficult. That's when you have to get inside of the language. Begin to understand the language. Understand the abstract. Understand what's maybe not the most easiest thing to understand. And be willing to make mistake after mistake after mistake. My time is almost up, so let me just give you the last leg, and we'll talk about this, in other videos. Another part, and this will help you with the concept, is understanding the culture of the language, understanding that Argentinian Spanish and Dominican Spanish is not the same. They're both correct, but they're different. Just like American English and British English is not the same. They're both correct, but they're different. So there's no judgment here. And I even argue understanding the history of the language. When I'm teaching ESL, one way or the other, I try to teach the history of English. Where did English come from? Why is it such a strange language in the sense that it's so irregular? And sometimes you can see Latin, and if you speak German, sometimes you can see German, sometimes you can see Norwegian, sometimes you can see other Northern European languages, other Germanic languages. But the hardest thing that I have found to teach, concepts, because this is something that we don't get a hold of even in our own language. Why do we use the tenses that we use? Why do we use the moods that we use? Why do we use the words that we use? Why would I say kid in one circumstance, child in another, right? And maybe boy and girl, which is, masculine and feminine. Why? That. So when we're in the next videos, we're going to talk about concepts of language and how that all interplays with the vocabulary and the structure and how concepts have a lot to do with the culture and the history. Like I said, this is not the easiest, these are not going to be the easiest videos for me to do, but I think it's important because we're now coming into a world where speaking Spanish as well as speaking English is going to be important. And those people who can only speak one versus speaking both are going to have a hard time. So once again, this is Corrala Ficklin-McClain from Welcome.com. And we're going to be talking about language and concepts and structure and vocabulary and culture and history. But language isn't impossible. And language is extremely necessary. Thank you very much. Thank you.